to the honors evening. We have the speakers standing a little askew tonight because a couple of them are going to use the screen, so they want to have visual sight of the screen. So we appreciate you coming. We have 4 speakers this evening. We'll start with Rylee Turner. After her, we'll go Gabe Reynolds, then Skylar, Stanley, and then Todd Hounchell is sitting in the cleanup spot this evening. Thank you for our panelists being here. After there's talk, we'll just go down the road. You guys each have a couple of questions that you submitted. Appreciate that. There are some really good questions on this topic, and as much as time allows, we'll go through those questions. If we have a little time at the end of a talk, you may allow 1 or 2 questions from the audience if you want, if we have time for a speaker. So we will introduce first with Rylee. Turn on. I got you here. I did something. There you go.
Happy Thursday, everyone. Thank you for all being here and supporting the 4 of us, as well as the program. Tonight I will be presenting on the similarities and differences between humans in zero gravity and humans in immobility-based conditions or on long-term bed rest, that kind of thing. Space has always been really intriguing to me, and this summer I got the chance to listen to a lot of the goings-on at NASA because my brother was doing an internship in Houston at the Johnson Space Center. So while listening to the goings-on there at NASA, I started to wonder how that research might impact my ultimate career goals in rehabilitation. My thought was to be able to compare my patients to astronauts when going through rehab and hard work and exercises to regain prior levels of health that they had once had, as both a motivational aspect and perhaps increase my creativity and understanding of exercise prescription. Very recently, I had the opportunity to speak with a NASA contractor and doctor of physical therapy who works as a science researcher and technical lead for the Exercise Physiology and Countermeasures Lab in the Johnson Space Center there in Houston. His name is John Hardy. You can see him up in the center spot. In this talk, I was able to pull from his insights as a prior orthopedic clinician, physical therapist, turned U.S. Special Operations physical therapist for the military in Hawaii, turned research scientist for NASA. This conversation was after most of my essay was written, but we discussed much of the points in my paper and the research I read online. And it really brought to life the information I had learned along the way that only someone who's actively working with current research and live astronauts could. So I will be drawing from a lot of his insights along with the research and findings from my paper. So the translation of knowledge between the impacts of spaceflight and immobility-based illnesses or conditions on Earth can be really insightful and informative while not having a perfect one-to-one similarities due to the really extreme and unique environments that is microgravity and outer space when compared to Earth here on with our atmosphere. There's still a lot to be learned there, so it was fun to look into that. So some background that since the 1960s, NASA has expanded their knowledge on the effects of zero gravity or microgravity on muscle mass, bone density, the brain, immunity, vision, postural control, the cardiovascular system, and much more, pretty much anything to do with the body since they started sending astronauts to space and even thinking about it. And they do this for the safety of their astronauts and to improve mission success and the length that they can have people in outer space. So leaving the gravitational force of Earth puts a lot of stress on the body by removing the mechanical loading of force our body is designed to undergo through mass and gravity here on Earth. All tissues and joints and even fluids within our body are meant to be compressed by gravity, stressed, and stretched through movement. When space removes this gravitational force and leaves astronauts really vulnerable to muscle atrophy, fluid shift in the inner ear and in the cardiovascular system, bone demineralization, and neuromuscular disconnect without the countermeasures that have been and are being researched and developed to support that long-term space travel. Patients with long stretches of immobility, whether from illness, surgery, fractures, complicated pregnancies, age, or other conditions, also face muscular atrophy, weakening, bone demineralization, loss of neural connections, and more. Many countermeasures exist for this population, but like space, more is always being developed and refined. So some similarities between the two populations, one of which being atrophy. Both astronauts and immobilized patients were found to experience the highest level of atrophy within the first days to 2 weeks that they were in space or laying down or not moving. Additionally, atrophy was not uniform within all the muscles in the body. It was more weighted towards postural muscles, so like ones in the spine, core, and lower extremity muscles, than some of the other ones you might think of. This can make sense because gravity puts force on those muscles. Even just when sitting, you're using your postural muscles to keep your neck upright, that kind of thing. So when you're put into zero gravity, those aren't being stressed unless put into a specific machine or thought about. So it can just weaken those muscles specifically, and then you're still making contractions to move around the inner ISS. So in astronauts, some countermeasures include mobilization and loading exercise. So they are required to work 2 hours per day on resistive weight exercises using the ARED machine, which is like a bench press weight machine. You can see it in the bottom left corner. Biking on a CVIS machine, which isn't pictured here, and the treadmill for running and cardiovascular work, which is the TVIS, which you can see the two pictures to the far right. They are specifically designed for space vehicles like the ISS and are being constantly engineered for new ways to both help them have that loading in space and also to make it more efficient for long-term space travel, smaller vehicles, or just less weight. Additionally, there is always being research to keep mobility within bedbound patients or lack of mobility there, to keep them active and counteract atrophy that slows the healing process by designing better hardware, tools, and exercises. Another similarity is bone demineralization and low back pain. The spine and bones of astronauts and bedridden individuals can be very affected. Their spine elongates due to a lack of compression, and bone density decreases without loading and resistance. Low back pain incidences are high, as astronauts are especially susceptible. Up to 70% experience it when they go to space, according to research I found from a 2015 article. Both groups also experience that bone mineral density loss, which can be a higher risk for fractures when they return to Earth or get up and start moving, especially when combined with that postural weak muscles. Some countermeasures are daily exercises and nutritional supplements. So some differences between the two populations, because they're obviously very in different circumstances, is the lack of fluid shift and blood normalization in Earth patients compared to astronauts. Without the gravitational pull on the blood cardiovascular system, while laying horizontal might decrease the blood pressure needed to circulate the blood and could weaken the heart muscle. Here on Earth, it still is pulling blood down to the lower extremities, but in space, that blood tends to float up to the head or higher in the body, which can then lead to significant changes there, even a puffier face when they return to Earth, just different places that fluid is. So that's a big difference, and NASA uses a lot of bed rest research to study the effects of space here on Earth in controlled labs, and to make a better similarity between space and lying in bed. They actually tilt their beds 6 degrees towards the head. You you can see a small picture of a woman volunteer here in kind of the middle left. And they do this to pull that fluid towards the head and try to mimic as best they can. So that's a bit of a difference because we generally don't make beds tilt towards the head here on Earth when patients are sick. And then another difference is space has the added hazard of much higher levels of radiation without the protective layer of Earth's atmosphere deflecting a lot of the harmful rays. There might be a parallel between cancer radiation, but that was definitely not where a lot of my research took me. There are many more comparisons that can be made, both for similarities and differences, and it left me with a lot of questions, but I want to focus now on some takeaways that I got and some goals and therapy to these kids or patients in general, because even astronauts have to go through pre, during, and post-physical therapy. They undergo years of training. During the mission, down to every 5 minutes are planned and accounted for, so they have very structured lives. And once they land back on Earth, they are put into weeks of post-mission rehabilitation to make sure that they fully regain their strength and they are doing well back here in gravity. So their hard work is all part of a bigger mission, and so too are every patient that comes into therapy. As the DPT and NASA scientist John Hardy says, clinicians need to be good stewards of progressive exercise prescription and conscientious of the best methods. So it was really cool to look into some of the things that NASA researchers and exercise scientists have been doing for their patients, and then think about how I can use it in my own work. And ultimately, God has given every human a mission to steward his creation, and he's the intentional and original designer. As Isaiah 42:5 puts it, the creator of the heavens, he is the creator of the heavens, who stretches them out, who spreads out the earth all that springs from it. So we have all been given different paths in life, whether to explore outer space as an astronaut or to overcome challenges of immobility, but we are all astronauts exploring his creation. Thank you.
Thank you, Rylee. All right, we're just going to start you, Luke, and we'll just go down the line. You submitted a couple of questions. Pick one of your two, and let Rylee explain.
I guess my question is, currently, how much research emphasis is being placed on this topic? Like what is the current scope of it right now?
Well, I would say that my research brought me to a whole spread of things. I think for space specifically, one of their big goals right now is figuring out what they need to do to get humans to Mars. So that's going to be a lot longer of a mission, taking months to get to Mars, and then they need to be able to withstand, I think Mars is about 0.6% of the gravity of here on Earth, so they need to be strong enough to go into that kind of gravitational field. So there's been a lot of research onto this kind of human side of things. Now, connecting it to rehab here on Earth and that kind of thing, I found a lot of essays on it, but I can't tell you exactly how much people are putting the two together right now.
Thank you. Laura?
I was wondering if there's a big difference in how we apply this research to geriatric populations versus just normal middle-aged bedridden people because of geriatric populations' differences in health.
Yeah, there's definitely a different, I feel like a lot of astronauts are on the younger side. Now that's not exactly true because I have a quote from a 7-year-old astronaut who recently came back. So there are some connections, and he actually mentioned that some of the hardest things he had to do when coming back was that postural, the hidden muscles you don't really think about. So there is some connection, but it can be a bit of a different population group from astronauts who are at the peak of their health in order to get to space versus geriatrics who maybe they haven't been taking care of their bodies as well as astronauts want to do.
Okay.
You talked some in your paper about how neural pathways can be lost while bedbound. Do you know much about how that is different for children, seeing as developing, and how them spending time bedridden could affect their development later on.
I didn't look into that a lot. My guess is that it could be severe just because they are building those connections and that's like a prime time to strengthen them and grow them, so you don't want to restrict that even more. But more what I saw was on like medications that can fog those connections and make it even harder, especially when lying stagnant. So I didn't see anything specifically for kids.
Intriguing question, though. Yeah, this is a different population for sure. Kayla?
So you mentioned that astronauts experience spinal elongation as a result of zero gravity, and I just kind of wanted to ask, do you think that this creates a permanent structural problem when they come back to Earth and gravity is reintroduced, or do you think that the program that they have helps them fully recover from that?
I believe they can recover. I saw that they did a lot of like rolling up into balls and like pressing that way while in space to kind of alleviate some of that pressure, along with like the resistive device here. So that seems to be helping. And then when they get back to Earth, I believe once they can regain that strength, it usually goes away. And I didn't see there could be an astronaut that keeps having low back pain even while back, but I didn't see that. So I think they are recovering.
Wow.
Based on your research, what would you claim to be the most detrimental side effect of prolonged microgravity exposure?
Based on my research and when I talking with John Hardy, he was saying that bone demineralization was one of the hardest things to counteract. Even with their running and forces, it still just wasn't as much pressure on the bones for them to grow as it is here. So, and they've also been working on nutritional countermeasures, but I don't think they've reached the point because they can still see like long-term effects even years after coming back to Earth. So I think that one's one of the longest term ones. I don't know if it's the most immediate problem, but it can be a long-term problem.
Ruth?
When you were researching this, did you come across any like ethical considerations about researching like long-term bed rest and microgravity on healthy individuals?
So you're meaning like the bed rest that they've done? I'm sure that when they do these, there's a lot of ethical questions that they have to go through. I know that all the patients are voluntary, and instead of doing like 9 months, like they send astronauts to space, usually the top is like 70 days. So they definitely shorten it compared to sending astronauts to space. But it seems like when I read blog posts about it, that everyone seems to really enjoy the process and learn a lot. I even saw some people brought their like master's thesis and just worked on it while laying in bed for weeks at a time. So it seems like they've done a really good job making it, but it's not something I would want to volunteer to do.
It's a unique kind of person that can give up their life for weeks at a time laying in bed. Yeah, that's only graduate students can have that kind of work to do. Eric.
So on Earth, you're standing and gravity is sort of putting a force parallel to the body. And when you're bedridden like that, then the force, it's not just a lack of that parallel force, then it's sort of an excess of perpendicular force, right? It's like coming to you from the side. Is there an effect to that? Now the gravity's pushing you that way?
I think the biggest effect of that would be things like bed sores, because we know that like in nursing homes they are constantly rotating people because if they're always being pressed down into the bed, that friction can cause those wounds. That does not happen as much in space. Now I have heard that the top of astronauts' feet actually get calluses because instead of walking around everywhere, they hook themselves onto different bars to stay there and not float away. So that's kind of a weird little, the bottom of their feet change, but and then the tops do as well. So here on Earth, the biggest thing I would think of would be bed sores.
Interesting questions. Yeah. There's the geometry of gravity here. Okay. All right, Sarah?
I was just wondering, I was thinking about how, for both astronauts going through all this vigorous training and bedridden patients and just spending so much time like that, I was just thinking about, the mental toll of all of that and the possibilities with that. So I was just wondering what you thought, what role did motivation and mindset and kind of just more psychological things had to do with all
think there's a lot, and I think NASA trains and puts their astronauts through specific classes because they're about to be in space for weeks at a time, completely separate from an entire planet. So I think that is a big emphasis, and maybe it's even a harder emphasis because there's some isolation if you're stuck in a hospital for a long period of time, especially if you don't have a good group support and family and that kind of thing. So there's definitely a connection there. I didn't look as much into the mental side of things, but I would say that there's a lot in space and they think about that, but the astronauts are very motivated because they've got a job to do and people are counting on them. And then people here on Earth, maybe they have a job to do to get back to, maybe they don't. So it could be either way.
Luke, your second question was kind of similar to that one. So if you don't mind, let's go to Laura, because you sort of answered Luke's second question already. Laura?
I was just wondering like how big a role diet and nutrition plays into this, and like what people are doing differently, specifically with the nutrition to kind of counteract this.
Yeah, I think nutrition is one of the biggest things that NASA and all the space agencies around the world are researching because they have it down to a science on what the astronauts eat throughout their stay so that they're getting all the nutrition that they need to support. So like I mentioned, the demineralization, they're working on so many different supplements to help them counteract that along with atrophy and everything that goes there. So I think for space, it's a huge thing. Now, John Hardy was saying that if he went back to being a clinician, he might emphasize nutrition more actually since coming back from NASA because he sees how effective it can be there. And, you know, it's about the same here. Like, it can be a big difference if people start focusing on what nutrition they're giving themselves. But it's not as big of a focus in just general PT or therapy right now.
Another good question, sort of stretching the discipline. Yeah, Mary.
Is there a certain like baseline health that astronauts are expected to have because they're going to experience these degradations, and you know how that would be assessed beforehand?
I'm sure that there are like numbers that they have to meet to qualify, kind of like going into the military. Actually, John Hardy, he worked in the countermeasures lab for a long time where they would go through tons of lab work to find those baseline numbers before they sent them to space, and then they could see how it changes as they are in space and come back. So it's like blood tests, a whole battery of those, physical exercises, VO2 maxes, a ton of different things. So I know that very few astronauts get chosen, so I'm guessing that their health is a big factor on who gets filtered out.
My question was kind of similar to one that was asked earlier, but you said that you wanted to use the astronaut analogy with your patients. So how do you think you will adjust that based off of pediatrics to people our age to geriatrics?
That's a good question. I believe for kids, I think I would just explain like even astronauts, if they're interested in that, even astronauts have to work hard and do this kind of thing because they're experiencing things like you if they're having weakness, that kind of thing. It could definitely be a little more technical with older populations. And then I think it would be, for geriatrics, fun to talk about them seeing like the first people going to the moon if they saw that or that kind of thing. So it would probably just change the dialogue a lot, but mostly I envision myself just having fun using that comparison.
Great. All right, the four of you, I'm not keeping track of everybody's questions. Who has a question that really sort of hasn't been asked yet? What was yours?
I think I do.
Okay, good.
Since microgravity would constitute an extreme environment where there would be like abnormal physiological responses, how can you apply that knowledge to physical therapy practices in non-extreme environments?
Well, obviously there are big differences, so you can't say A equals B, but I think it's just kind of a way to inform. I think when they first started sending people to space, they used a lot of the exercises and ideas we use for people here and put them and just started trying them in space. So then things that they now just try for their astronauts, we can think about, would this be helpful for our patients here? So kind of that translation there, especially because there's a lot of resources going into things like NASA and other space agencies, whereas there's definitely resources going into research for medical things, but there's a lot more focus and attention, so it just is like the high-end research there could be good to pull into like therapy and stuff.
Okay. Ruth? No? Eric? No? Sarah? All right. Anyone from the audience have a question? We have time for about one, maybe two questions. One question. All right. Thank you, Rylee. Appreciate it. Well done. All right. Next up, Gabe Reynolds on
It's a mouthful.
the abolition of authentic experience. Abolition of authentic experience.
Hey, good evening, everyone. In this topic, I want to dive into philosophy, this postmodern philosophy, more of a modern take. A lot of philosophies from old days. You think about Plato, Aristotle, and Socrates, but there's still philosophers. There's this man, John Baudrillard, who presents some things we'll get into later, but I want to start with kind of the purpose of the paper and why this matters to us. A lot of it's about awareness of the reality that we're presented with. The Truman Show presents a chilling line that says, "We accept the reality of the world with which we are presented." It's as simple as that, really. And there's truth in this quote, and that's what makes it so chilling. And I hope that I can present the philosophy of Baudrillard in a way that gives us awareness of the reality being presented to us in modern Western society, so we can choose to either embrace a reality, embrace the reality presented to us, if it truly aligns with our worldview, or we have the option to go a different direction and push our society, or what drives society, in the direction we want it to go. So, with that being said, I'll start introducing kind of the philosophy, John Baudrillard, postmodernism. But thank you all for being here. Over the summer, there was this lecture I ran across at Duke University by Rick Roderick about the work of John Baudrillard. A 20th century philosopher. You think about the 20th century, he grew up in a time with the rise of mass media, consumer culture, and television, things that started to blur reality and a simulation, a representation of reality, which is what postmodernism is. It's about the fusing of us and technology and media and like authentic experience, real human interaction. Now, I'll kind of get into what exactly hyperreality means. It said hyperreality can be described as a state where simulations we create of reality, of true reality, are indistinguishable from true reality. The real goal of the simulation is to make a version of reality that eliminates the difficult or negative parts of true reality. It keeps all the dopaminergic things, the pleasurable things that make things appealing, and removes that because it's what sells. It's what gets clicks. It's what gets people drawn to things, and that's why society is so pushed towards it with our being drawn by, consumerism and greed, that kind of thing. So Baudrillard uses an example of Epcot. When he visits it, he says, "This is much better than Europe. The food's better than Europe, and it's a short walk between France and Germany land. And you don't have to deal with all those nasty waiters. Everyone's so polite." This is an example that can make it tangible for you guys about like what this philosophy points to. Baudrillard would suggest that our world is moving towards a completely simulated world that rejects negative experience, and with the negative experience, it has to therefore reject authentic human experience. Think of anything that's difficult, that's worth doing. Everyone wants to be fit, but only some put in the work to actually be fit. This is what makes it valuable. And if it was something everyone could do easily, there'd be no value in it. I kind of think of even the quote from Incredibles where he says, "If in a world where everyone's super, nobody is. If we have this, if we can get anything we want without struggle, everything lacks meaning." And that's the society we're being pushed towards. So we've kind of seen what Baudrillard meant by hyperreality, and I want to show kind of some examples of how this shows up in our modern lives. We see a trajectory that AI is going towards. As AI becomes more advanced, it learns more and more, and it learns to talk more like a human does and act more like a human does. You've heard of maybe, I think it's called a Turing test, where it's if AI becomes artificial intelligence when you can't distinguish it between talking to a human and talking to a computer. Because AI has access to kind of what we see as the best writings, best speeches, best art, so that it can learn from that and extract all the positive things from it and remove like human errors from it. So it becomes increasingly better at simulating human voices, writings, and even photographs of people, as we can see today. The simulation and reality become more indistinguishable. Roderick in his lecture used this example. He says, "When I was a kid, I dreamed about dinosaurs. I had a little Walt Disney dinosaur book. Why would I need to dream about dinosaurs now? Steven Spielberg has made them. He has filmed them. They are more real than real dinosaurs. They are hyper-real. You would be disappointed if you saw Tyrannosaurus Rex after the movie. It would be disappointing. It wouldn't be as noisy or scary or frightening. The same is true of Jaws, you know." Roderick says, "I've actually caught some rather large sharks, but those experiences are so boring compared to Jaws. Jaws is a hyper-real experience." And we see this quote from Roderick in 1933, and really 30 years later, it becomes more and more applicable. The trajectory we're facing is towards hyper-reality. We see a similar trajectory in algorithms used by social media. This is something I didn't touch in my paper, but in hindsight, I realized it's huge and shows how social media is a huge proponent for this kind of worldview. So the goal of an algorithm is to show you exactly what you want to see. It wants to show you all the positives, all the bright colors, bright sounds. This is kind of why short-form content has become so pervasive in our society. You have TikTok, which led rise to Instagram Reels, YouTube Shorts. Everything in social media has started to go towards short-form content because a video is more real than photos, and sounds are more real than a picture that's still. Bright colors, everything reality can offer, but in a simulated form, with the brightest colors and most extreme emotions. This is what gets more interaction with the audience because it's more dopaminergic, or at least more dopamine in your brain, which is kind of our motivational circuit. It caters to everyone because it's personalized to whatever makes you personally feel more positive emotions because of the interactions you have with social media. We see social media filters and AI influencers. Think about taking a picture and then you put a filter on that. Is that still a real picture? Yeah, in many ways it's a real picture. Use Photoshop it. Is that still a real picture? You think about the trajectory of, I feed this picture into AI and it creates kind of a simulated version of it with this thing tweaked and that. Is that a real picture? Still based on reality. You can kind of start to see how the lines blur of reality and a hyper-reality. We see the same thing in like deep fakes. There's even people with AI-generated relationships. People are getting, I don't know, because in an AI-generated relationship, there's no vulnerability, there's no risk really involved. So you can have all the positives without the negatives, without a human experience. And this awareness is really what is crucial to our free will to choose what we want, rather than just being presented with a reality with no critical thought of if that reality is genuine and what we want out of our lives. Another one of my points focused on technology in my paper, and I touched on AI, but I see the same thing in what I said about social media and video games. The whole goal of a video game, like Call of Duty and a first-person shooter game, is to simulate reality. But why not just live in reality? Why not go to war? Because there's loads of things in war that are completely negative. You can get shot and die. You can experience trauma that leads to PTSD. So you can play a video game instead and live a reality, feel accomplished about what you're doing with wins and losses. There's even like negative things about the video game that makes us want to win more. And that's even making hyper-reality closer to reality. They take negative things and insert it even into the positive things because that is what sells more. You think of a casino, how it has a certain amount of times you lose before you win, because that makes the win more rewarding, makes you feel part of the game. The negatives are taken out. So the point of all this is using the tendency of the brain to be motivated by dopamine to maximize user consumption. Consumption of content is in a lot of ways based on dopamine. And that's what pushes the market towards simulating reality, because that's how our brains work, how they function. We have a dopamine circuit and a serotonin circuit, and dopamine is kind of more related to instant gratification, motivation to, say, eat, or accomplish something, and serotonin is more of a long-term, think about, I can't think of the word, really feeling fulfilled. That's more of a serotonin thing than a dopamine circuit. But this dopamine circuit is what sells, and so that's what we get in society. So this is what pushed Baudrillard. He knew a couple things about the brain. He saw what society was looking like, and it pushed him to suggest and warn that society will only continue to move toward this kind of simulated reality. So the idea of avoiding the hard parts of reality doesn't even just show up in this entertainment and technology. I even see it appear in mental health. I did my last honors paper, if anyone remembers, on psychotropic medication, which is the kind of medication that deals with mental processes. And so I kind of see a link to hyperreality in this. It's really hard to generalize this topic because the field we don't fully understand. But the connection I really want to make is that the goal of these medications is to offer a much easier solution than dealing with trauma or changing the patterns of your life. In many cases, it's a combination of life change and medication that is what will help with these conditions. But as I presented my paper on somewhat last year, the pill is presented as a quick magic fix. So you have no need of dealing with negative things one would rather not think about. In hyperreality and modern psychiatry, there's kind of a tension between dealing with pain and taking the path of least resistance. We always want to take the path of least resistance, whether that's the right thing to do or not. Medication can be life-saving and essential, but as a society, we've developed a reflex to treat symptoms rather than addressing deeper causes because it's much easier. Baudrillard might say this is another way to simulate wellness instead of pursuing authentic wellness. So finally, I want to give a kind of a spiritual application about how this kind of transcends beyond culture and technology, but it can really challenge how we live out our faith and values. Jesus talked about said of the Pharisees, "They honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me." The Pharisees cared much more about the physical positives of their faith and lost their regard for an authentic relationship with God. This is what we need to be careful with in our own lives. Are we better than the Pharisees? Jesus says that our faith must surpass that of the scribes and the Pharisees because he wants our relationship not to be outward, not to be a simulation of it, but to be a deep relationship with him. So kind of in modern society, we see a saturation of Christian culture with different meanings and kind of baggage that comes with just the title of even Christian. You think about the thousands of denominations and different interpretations of doctrines we cling to. This was a problem in the Old Testament. The Pharisees wanted the positives of their religion without doing things like caring for the poor. We want to show that we are a Christian without doing the hard things about it, eliminating the negative and moving towards positive and therefore inauthentic things. The story of the Good Samaritan is a perfect representation of it. Most outwardly religious people were using their lineage and title to be authentic and understand that the easy thing to do, to be authentic and, to present, they were using their lineage and title to present people with a reality about the religion, a hyper-reality of this is, I want you to see me as this, but I don't want to do the hard things about it. So we really have to be careful to be authentic and understand that the easy thing to do and what we will tend towards is showing positives and avoiding the negatives. We really have to be truly committed to good works. I talked about the symbol of the cross in my paper. Many wear a cross, but it's lost its religious context. It serves more of an aesthetic purpose than it does a symbol of self-sacrifice and a reminder of the death our Savior died. Am I presenting the same symbol without genuine faith, or do I truly mean it when I show the symbol of being crucified with Christ? It's a scary reality that we must come to terms with and question ourselves constantly, because the easy thing to do is to put on a spiritual persona without making it truly who you are. And if Baudrillard teaches us anything, it's that meaning comes from embracing both joy and struggle of being human, not escaping into simulations. Spiritually, this means living out a life of faith that costs something. Socially, it means being aware of the forces that shape our perceptions. And personally, we must ask ourselves, are we living real lives or performing versions of one? In the end, Baudrillard's philosophy is not, I don't want it to just sound like an abstract technology or culture, but more of a mirror that he's holding up to everyone. Ask yourself, are you truly living or participating in a simulation that's offered to you? We see a world that presents us with comfort, rewards, pleasure, and constant simulation. And then if we act authentically, that's an act of resistance towards the pleasure, comfort, and constant simulation we see. The same awareness applies in our inner lives. Whether it's through media, medication, or even religion, we're always tempted to smooth out the rough edges of existence, to avoid pain and uncertainty. But it's often through those difficult, unfiltered experiences that real growth and meaning are found. Spiritually, this means that faith isn't performative. It's transformative. It's not about curating a religious image, but about living with sincerity and humility when no one's watching. The cross was never meant to be aesthetic. It was meant to remind us that redemption is costly and authenticity requires sacrifice. My hope is that the awareness of these ideas, the awareness of a hyperreality, simulation, and easy substitutes for meaning, help us to see through the illusion that reality presents us with. If we can recognize the difference between what is real and what only appears to be real, then we can choose truth even when it's difficult, and that is really the choice that makes us human.
Thank you, Gabe. Thank you. All right, some heady things to think about there. Sarah, why don't you start us off?
You did a really great job, and I was just wondering, you talk about AI and like technology being one of the main ways that this idea of like hyper reality and just avoiding reality is coming through. And I was just wondering what you think the balance of still using that is, because I feel like it's kind of unavoidable that technology is a tool that a lot of people are using in business and all these things. So I was just wondering what you think about the balance of still using it, but also restoring authenticity
Yeah.
to it.
I think that was one of the main critiques when I was looking at Boudreaux's work. He was like, technology's all bad, terrible, get rid of it. It's going to end up simulating, it's going to take over. That was kind of his thought. So that is like something to think about. There's obviously a lot of uses for AI. And so I think it's really like what I was talking about the awareness of it. Like, am I using AI to think for me, to create these things for me, to create like a perfect version of it? And am I using it to avoid, I don't know, rejection? Like if I create something with AI and then someone doesn't like that, that's never personal with me. So it can be a way to escape and avoid that kind of rejection that we can feel. So I think a lot of it comes from the awareness of it. And that's one of the whole points of my paper is like, when we're using these things, be careful and be aware of why you're using it, I guess. Eric.
So I was thinking of an author that we just talked about in one of my English classes, William Dean Howells, and he critiques romantic literature pretty roughly because he says, oh, these authors, they're trying to portray life as some sort of ideal, but what we should do is present life how it is. So this genre we call realism. And I read his book, and it's one of the most boring books that I ever read. So my concern is, is there that balance that you have to achieve between idealism and between realism, and like, how do you go about finding exactly where that line is?
It's a good question. Think about like reality and like realism, just reality, and hyper-reality. I think even those like romantic things, a lot of it still deals with a lot of negative experiences, and it's just about more the human condition. And part of it is avoidance is part of the human condition. Like that's what we love to do is avoid negative experiences. But even romantic things, I don't know, there's always dramatized things about the loss of a love that we once had, and like I think a lot of it points to we just need to learn from negative experiences, because I don't know, I think this is why the Bible uses so many metaphors and things that could be considered romanticism, like metaphoric language, because there's more to reality than just materialism. And thinking about psychologists that are, I don't know, I was just learning about this in Gen we are is matter in the brain. And the reality of the spiritual case is that there's more to it than that. So that's a tough question. Like, what's the balance between reality? Because I think it's similar to the balance between, I don't know, thinking there's only materialism and knowing that there's a God. And how does that play into our human experience, I guess?
Great. Yeah, both those questions sort of get to balance, right? You can't throw technology out. Right? That's not an option.
Yeah.
AI's coming, so we're just going to avoid. That's not an option. You gotta deal with it. It's a really interesting question. Is there a place for something that isn't just realism?
Yeah.
Even in Scripture, I'm teaching Ezekiel right now. There's some hyper-reality stuff in Ezekiel. Some pretty amazing, kind of fantastic language and images, but it's there very, very purposeful. Right? It's not fluff or clickbait. It's there trying to accomplish something that is very real. Right? So it's using a hyper-real language to convey something that's fundamentally very real. So interesting questions. Yeah.
Yeah.
Great. Ruth.
I was just wondering, like, in your opinion, how do you think we could go about rebuilding, or like traits that, like perseverance and valuing, gaining wisdom through negative experiences in a society that values like ease and comfort?
Yeah, I'm thinking a lot of it is about, I don't know, this is what our call as Christians to some extent is. We see negative experiences, we see sin in the world, and instead of avoiding it, or even saying, I don't know, you can avoid it and push it away, or you can even just be completely unfeeling about it. And both of those are bad. So if we kind of run at negative experiences, then, I don't know, I think our goal is to, I don't know, take sin, like when you think about, if somebody slaps you on the cheek, turn to them the other also. We see a negative experience as Christians, and instead of like perpetuating the negativity, we just like, I don't know, give it to our Lord. I don't know if this is answering your question. I feel like sometimes I get off in the weeds, but I think a lot of it has to do with, we need to embrace negative experiences because they're also things given to us by God. You think about emotions, we feel fear. That's really to push you away from something, tell you that you need to change this. You have sadness or heartbreak, like you need to change this experience and see kind of the positives in negative experience, like why are they there? What can we learn from them, I think.
Great. Maybe sort of getting back to what Rylee's talk is about, the physical body needs a weight and load on it to be healthy on earth. We as people need a weight and a load on ourselves that comes from hardship to be healthy.
Yeah.
And we're just designed that way, physically and spiritually. And, at least here on this earth, that's how it's going to work. Great. Hallie.
Do you think that the negative effects of rapid technological advancements and societal shifts causes a progressive deterioration of fundamental human values and morals?
I do think a lot of the rapidity of how quickly, especially you think of the like this revolution of technology being introduced and how technology helps us to make technology better, and then AI does the same thing. So I think the rapidity of it gives us less of an opportunity to kind of think about what we're doing even. So I think a lot of it comes from how rapidly changing everything is. Do we know how to deal with it? Are we asking questions about how do we handle this healthfully and do it responsibly? But what's more, I don't know, propagated by society is we want more money. We want more experience, more dopamine in some ways. So I think the rapidity of it speaks a lot to why it is bad in some ways. We don't have time to think about it. We don't have time to be responsible with the actions we choose.
Caleb.
This is kind of just a clarifying question, but do you think that the authenticity of a negative experience outweighs the authenticity of positive experiences, or do you think that there can still be some authenticity with comfortability?
I think there's definitely authenticity in both. It's just that you need both, and what humans want is only positive experiences. We're not pushed in the direction of negative experience. Like, we obviously need positive experience, but we really need negativity to feel positive experiences better. sure we need positive experiences to feel negative experiences better in the same way. We're just not pushed as a society that way. And maybe I could think of an example of some, I don't know, how you can't feel a negative experience without a positive one. But I think, yeah, a lot of it comes like both are necessary, and we want to think that only positive things are necessary. But they definitely both are.
Mayor.
I think that objectively, like, everyone can recognize disasters and tragedies that are reality. So how do you think that people kind of rationalize those things in order to live in this like ideal, hyper-realistic worldview?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think even technology is pushing us. I think about even like natural disaster is something like you think about doom scrolling. Doom scrolling is kind of how you see negative news and kind of that's pushed your way, but a lot of that comes from we want more knowledge of what is going on, whether it's positive or negative. But I think that's something about, I don't know, the hand of God in our society that reminds us of negative experiences. There's nothing we can do to, I mean, maybe there's some postmodern society that has technologized everything and we can control weather. So maybe that's kind of where it's headed in Baudrillard's mind. We're going to be able to control weather and we'll get rid of that. We'll only have sunshine and rainbows all day. Like in the Truman Show you think about. Like there was only stormy weather when they wanted him to stay on the island, that kind of thing. Push him back towards the positive. So even the negative could be used, like in the Call of Duty example, you don't win every time. But that wouldn't be as rewarding, so they want maximum reward. I don't know if that makes sense.
Laura.
Do you think that religion being used as a political tool today is an example of these philosophies?
I mean, I absolutely do. I think of, I don't know, how we have separation of religion and state in America, and that's because in the Roman Empire, a lot of the religion, since it was tied to, I don't know, higher status in the Kingdom of Rome, that made it to where people weren't really religious. And we can see a lot of the disaster of that with the Dark Ages. People just wanted the status of it. And so we can see that in a way when Christian culture is what's cool, which is honestly a big danger of FC. Like, do we have a people that are acting Christian because it's a Christian school and that is what's cool here? Or do we have people with an authentic relationship to God? But I think it's a good question about the religion and hyper-reality. It's very interesting.
Religion has always been a political tool, hasn't it?
Yeah.
Always been, every season, you'll see our politicians at prayer breakfasts and talking to big mega churches and things.
Yeah.
It's always been a part of that discourse. Luke?
So you kind of answered both of my questions in your talk, but so I have another question for you.
Good for you.
How would you say that mental health and mental disorders play into this? Like, would you place that as something real or something hyper-real? Because, I mean, you can see, like, social media and mental disorders, the graphs are correlated, you know, and just with the rise of technology, mental disorders have been increasing. And so I guess, what category would you place that in?
Yeah, this is definitely just my opinion. I don't know if I have science to back it up, but in my opinion, a lot of, and maybe all, well, definitely not all mental disorders, but there's like mental health things like depression, anxiety. I think a lot of them are a result of negative experiences that have been escaped and avoided for a long time. Like you think about what you're saying, with the rise of social media, there's more anxiety, more depression. There's more, because there's more opportunity to escape. I can think about, in the past, I don't know, there's no technology. What do people do except sit around and talk with each other, whatever. But now I can escape towards this reality where I can swipe and see whatever I want and then swipe again and see whatever I want. I never have to think about the negative emotions, and I think those pile up and end up becoming those kind of depression, anxiety type things, which kind of we see in trauma research, where trauma at younger ages leads to higher likelihood of mental disorders. So it's my opinion that a lot of that is due to escapism and hyperreality. And then that's why a medication can't just fix it. A medication can be helpful if you deal with those emotions that were never resolved and never dealt with.
All right, anyone else with a follow-up question? We have just a couple minutes. Anybody else have a second question they'd like to ask? No? All right, anyone from the audience have a question you'd like to ask? Intrigued by authentic, yeah.
I have a question. This is kind of more on like your technical, like kind of physiological side. You talked about like the difference between dopamine and serotonin. In your research, did you come across anything, like specifically in children and their developing brains, and how dopamine versus serotonin has an effect on them physiologically?
I definitely didn't come across any of that specifically in children in my research. I imagine developing brains would become, I mean, they just will propagate whatever they're shown more because they're so impressionable. We see that with learning languages, much easier for them. They are much better at doing what they see. So I think that even gets to part of like their place inside. I think, excuse me, the guy that I was talking about, the lecturer Roderick, brought up this example of when he sees his kid yelling at his Nintendo. He's like, what are you doing yelling at this Nintendo? And the kid looks at him as if he's from a different universe, a different reality. And to the kid, he is from a different reality. In the reality, that experience of Nintendo is the most exciting and awesome thing he's seen all day. And we see that even more, like, I'm sure kids are going to be more and more tend towards more escapism. And I think that goes to also the rise of social media with the rise of depression and anxiety. When younger people get technology, it is just, will have a like dramatic effect on our brain.
Okay, thank you very much. Appreciate it.
You cannot accuse Russian novelists of being overly optimistic. So Skylar's got to come and talk about the juxtaposition, the very interesting juxtaposition of calculus and Leo Tolstoy.
Good evening. So as already been announced, I'm doing a combination of math and Russian literature. As a member of the honors program, I've been trying to figure out how I can incorporate more math into these presentations without just talking math. And since it is an interdisciplinary program, well, it makes sense to combine it with some other things. So Leo Tolstoy does actually use a lot of mathematical analogies and metaphors in his writing, so he's definitely the prime author to look at for math and literature. So this evening we're going to look at his clearest uses of math, particularly calculus, which is my favorite, and which occurs in War and Peace, and then see how calculus really takes on a symbolic value in some of his other works as well. So let's get started. For those of you unfamiliar with War and Peace, it was written in the 1860s, but it's set during Russia's wars with Napoleon in about 1805 to 1812, and it interweaves not only a lot of historical narration, but then, of course, the storyline, the fictional storyline, and then a lot of the author's just extended philosophical thoughts about everything from the nature of warfare to fate and free will. And it's within these more theoretical sections that we'll be dealing with this evening. It's one of these sections that starts part 3 of book 3 of War and Peace, where Tolstoy presents what is perhaps the best use and most sophisticated use of mathematics and literature, and that is when he uses integral calculus as a metaphor for how he thinks history should be understood. So he starts this part, he shifts rather unexpectedly away from what he has been describing, the Battle of Borodino, to all of a sudden talking about the continuity of motion and how human reason can't really comprehend it, and talks briefly about how the ancient Greeks tried to understand motion in discrete units and then really just came to a bunch of paradoxes. So then he brings in calculus, or what he calls a new branch of mathematics, to show how those motion problems have been resolved and the paradoxes and everything. But then he takes a shift and starts to apply the same ways of thinking about motion to thinking about history. So I'm going to read a little bit what he writes here. He writes, "The movement of mankind, perceiving from a countless number of human wills, occurs continuously. To comprehend the laws of this movement is the goal of history. But in order to comprehend the laws of the continuous movement of the sum of all individual wills, human reason allows for arbitrary, discrete units." He then goes on to criticize historians, which he frequently does in War and Peace, who think of history in discrete units and then come to what he considers false conclusions. He considers it almost like trying to approximate a curve by straight lines to get back into our calculus language when they think of history in more discrete units. And then he goes on to kind of the main part of this. He says, "Only by admitting an infinitesimal unit for observation, a differential of history, that is, the uniform strivings of people, and attains the art of integrating them, taking the sum of these infinitesimal quantities, can we hope to comprehend the laws of history." So here, Tolstoy argues that history is continuous, just like physical motion, which means that all historical events flow together smoothly without beginning or end. And he wants us to think about history like motion, which means that there should be some sort of non-arbitrary, infinitesimal unit of observation that can be summed together, and the calculus-like process to arrive at the true laws of history. And these laws are laws in the more scientific sense, just like there's laws that govern the motion of planets, the gravitational laws. He suggests that there's laws that govern the movement of humankind. He really envisions an historical science that follows the same course as math and physics and begins to seek more for laws and common properties and looking for causes. So to understand this use of calculus further, we don't have much time, but I do want to look briefly into what he means by the differential of history. He refers to it in one place as the individual wills that are being summed up. And I think it's interesting because the term he uses in Russian has more of a connotation of a freedom, the word will has more of a connotation of freedom from restraint and the capacity to take advantage of that freedom to do as one pleases. It's not so much of this sense of purpose and direction like in the English language. So from this, Tolstoy suggests that history flows from the actualization of each individual's potential to act freely. But looking even a little bit deeper, human wills aren't quite the infinitesimal that Tolstoy describes. He also uses the phrases uniform strivings of people, or equal and inseparably bound together infinitely small elements of freedom, which suggests that the differential is a sort of irreducible essence of this freedom to act. One scholar describes it as a freedom unknowable in itself. So here we have the laws of history that Tolstoy believes in, ultimately coming from human freedom. So on the surface, there appears to be a contradiction here because he says that there's laws and then also freedom. Really, his whole use of calculus as a model definitely recalls a lot of the deterministic ideas that arose in the early 19th century after the discovery of calculus and were popularized by mathematicians such as Laplace. Since calculus provided a way to ascertain patterns of motion based on initial conditions such as velocity or acceleration, Laplace extended this idea to suggest the entire universe is a system whose past and future states could be calculated by some intelligence who could know the status of every force acting upon it. So in light of this, Tolstoy's model does seem to imply a highly deterministic view of history, meaning that actions are determined by laws and not really free will. And a lot of scholars have kind of taken that approach on him, but he still regards freedom as a very real concept. So how one can make sense of the reality of both having laws, this determinism, or as Tolstoy uses the word sometimes, necessity, and then also having human freedom, that's going to take a deeper look into the symbolism of calculus in Tolstoy's works. So we're going to shift gears here for a minute. We'll come back to the history stuff in a moment. But I want to take a look at the relationship between truth and reason that Tolstoy talks about in his memoir Confession, as a way to understand further the symbolism of calculus in his works. So Tolstoy's memoir Confession, it describes his spiritual journey away from the Russian Orthodox Church towards atheism and ultimately towards a kind of Christian spirituality. It describes how he comes to a point in his life where he really reaches a point of despair at the futility of finding meaning through logic and reasoning alone. And as he comes to understand that religion is a valid means for understanding reality, he begins to shift in his thinking. And I'm going to read a passage here from Confession. He writes, "So apart from rational science, which previously seemed to me the only one, I was inescapably led to recognize the whole of living mankind has another irrational science, faith, which gives the possibility of living. All the irrationality of faith remained the same for me as before, but I couldn't fail to recognize that it alone gives mankind answers to the questions of life and consequently the possibility of living." So in Tolstoy's thinking, there's this tension between reason and faith. Understandably, after years of believing that only reason is trustworthy, he struggles to trust in anything that he can't come to through reason alone. But what I point out about the passage I just read was that he still considers faith to be irrational. Although he comes to accept both reason and faith being valid means of knowing things, both being true, there's still a separation between them that Tolstoy has trouble overcoming. And it's in this tension between knowledge, reason, and faith that the symbolism of calculus emerges. One scholar, Tim Lagan, who wrote a really interesting article that I've been inspired by, he writes that calculus in War and Peace Confession is a model of something that Tolstoy desires but does not attain, the total synthesis of logic and truth. So, in essence here, the symbolism of calculus is that there does exist a comprehensible relationship between the finite, in this case human reason, and the infinite, in this case transcendent truth, even though that relationship may only make sense from an infinite perspective. Talking for a moment about math and mathematical calculus, the true relationship between a straight tangent line and the curve it touches only makes sense when the concept of infinity is introduced. Likewise, if explaining the world through reason alone is like trying to understand the curve of truth with straight lines, then reconciling faith and logic requires an infinite, eternal perspective. Tolstoy came to discover this perspective, what we could call the limit of human reason, and perhaps the limit of all existential questions, is God himself, the source of all life and truth. So in this way, calculus serves as a tool for connecting the finite with the infinite, both mathematically, of course, and through symbolic extension, metaphysically as well. All of that in mind, let's take a step back to our discussion of history, because I think it becomes clearer how necessity, this determinism, and individual freedom can exist in Tolstoy's thinking. In fact, he connects those two concepts to other similar concepts he calls reason also, and then the idea of consciousness. And once again, we need to clarify some of Tolstoy's translated terms. The Russian word for consciousness refers more to a kind of personal and immediate form of knowledge gained from experience, and it's apart from rational cognition. So he basically argues that through reason and through thinking, humans understand that there's some amount of determinism. They don't exactly have free will, but it's through this more immediate form of knowledge, this consciousness, that humans do believe in their own freedom. And while it could be tempting at this point to choose either reason or consciousness as the only valid source of knowledge, Tolstoy sees no reason to view them as mutually exclusive. They can both be true. And that's what this whole economy between reason and consciousness and reason and faith really demonstrates, is that two opposing sources of knowledge can be true at the same time. So Tolstoy's going back to his use of calculus to describe history, even inserting calculus in there like that demonstrates how freedom and necessity can coexist, interact with each other in the development of human history. Looking deeper into Tolstoy's thinking, it becomes clear that he thinks that necessity dominates human behavior on the larger scale of history and all the laws, whereas freedom is what dominates on the individual level. One scholar writes, "Freedom and necessity meet only in the truly individual act. One is most free, one is most personal and most immediate, in Tolstoy's radical sense, because it is only then that one has given up the wrong freedom of commanding life and has permitted the world in all its complexity to rise in one's consciousness." It's this freedom to act in one's immediate environment that is truly the foundation of history. And although the connection linking freedom and determinism is far from clear still, the symbolism of calculus suggests that they are related. And to Tolstoy, they depend upon each other, just like determining a curve depends on knowing its slope at every point. So in this world, with all its apparent incongruities, Tolstoy shows how calculus offers a way of understanding how seemingly contradictory ideas can in fact be reconciled. An infinite perspective is how all things, from reason and faith to necessity and freedom, find coherence. To conclude, there's one last point I want to clarify, and you're probably sitting there thinking there's a lot of things I need to clarify. But one thing I want to clarify is that this idea of faith being irrational. And I'm certainly not talking about a sort of blind faith or faith without reason, but rather it means that believing in God requires more than just human reason and logic, since the existence of God is not scientifically provable. Believing in God requires the kind of faith that the Hebrews writer describes as assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. For such logically minded individuals as Tolstoy, who want every belief they hold to come from irrefutable logical arguments, the acceptance of a faith that transcends reason can be particularly difficult. Because while studying a lot of evidences and apologetics is certainly helpful, there's still an extent to which faith definitely comes down to a choice. And so for those kind of logically minded individuals, I think mathematical analogies can be particularly helpful for understanding how concepts that human reason cannot fully comprehend, like infinity, can solve effects in the material world that demonstrate their existence. Thank you.
Thanks, Skylar. Appreciate that. All right, Luke, start us off.
Okay, so the question was, how does Tolstoy's deterministic perspective affect his thinking about the historicity of Christianity? And I guess what I wanted to focus on with that question is really Tolstoy's view on Jesus as a human, because would he still be subject to the deterministic free will paradox that all other humans are subject to?
That is a fascinating question. Definitely not something I looked into. Tolstoy definitely has a lot of thoughts about a lot of things. It'd be interesting to study more. I have not really looked into his religious beliefs much, so I'm sorry.
Good. Oh, that's good. Yeah, Laura.
I was wondering how this calculus symbolism could justify a supernaturalistic worldview versus a naturalistic worldview.
Well, I think it definitely comes down to, again, the idea of an infinite eternal view. Yeah, this is such a hard topic. It's hard to get questions of, and I didn't research every single aspect of it, so I'm not sure how much I can help. But good questions for sure.
They are this is the kind of topic that produces questions that are big.
Yes.
Yeah. So don't feel bad that you can't answer all these questions, but they're intriguing questions, right? It stretches the mind, which is good, right? That's good for us to carry a mental load. Getting back to our first few talks, right? This is good, and so you're doing great. Don't worry about it, Mary.
How do you think that this approach to history could remove some discrepancies that come with each culture kind of writing their own history of an event? And how could that change if you see it more from the outside perspective?
Yeah, I think it definitely would change it. I'm trying to think, because a lot of his writings on history are very centered and especially War and Peace, about the history of that time period. In which case, France has Napoleon has a very different view than the Russians of what happened with all of that. And I think he would honestly just look at more of a lot of that happened because it was going to happen, because it was supposed to happen, not so much of one person says it happens because of this, one person says it happened because of that, and it's different. It's more there's kind of an infinite number of causes. Maybe we never quite know what causes it. There's, even the smallest things could have caused it. So it's more of an idea of that was what was going to happen.
Kayla?
Could you just expand a little bit on how the infinite perspective can influence our understanding of moral responsibility throughout history?
That's also a big question. Yeah, that's a hard one. And I don't even know if some of Tolstoy's morals would line up with what we would think they should. But just anytime you recognize the eternal and spiritual religion, it's going to change your morals. I don't have much else other than that.
Yeah, that's ultimately what the Bible's calling us to be, right? To have a mind increasingly like God's, and that's going to fundamentally then affect, I think your question was, what was it? Get my questions right. Understanding of moral responsibility in history, right? That we we have a part in history, an infinitesimal part. 7 billion people on the planet. My life has not changed in a whole lot of this world's history. That's part of the.
Okay, maybe I misunderstood your question.
Okay, I think that's what she's after. You want to pick up?
Moral responsibility to contributing to history? Okay, yeah. So I think you would think more of, you can't really change history. So focusing just on your immediate environment, what's immediately happening to you, and I guess doing your best there will actually have pretty big impact to other things. But if you try and go out and change history, it's not going to do anything. Okay. Your questions, it's like, it's hard to like understand exactly what you're asking when there's a, yeah.
Yeah, we get it. How?
Considering Tolstoy's contradictory undertones of determinism and also his strong beliefs in individual free will, would you argue that his philosophical outlook is more in line with historical determinism or not?
Yeah, it's interesting. So there are a lot of scholars who've looked at it and been like, okay, purely deterministic, but I think he definitely takes a more balanced approach and finds more how they interact and how they both exist than really looking at purely deterministically. It is really interesting because, you could definitely spend this whole talk to actually start thinking about the plot of War and Peace. It's nice I didn't have to talk about that at all, but you can definitely see how he's playing with a lot of these similar themes within his storylines and how he portrays the wars that go on.
Great. Ruth.
I find this very interesting. I don't think I could have ever made up this knowledge on my own, so thank you for this. But you kind of touched on this in your talk just now, but do you think that Tolstoy used calculus as a way to show how God works, like creating order and patterns that guide the world and human history?
I don't think I would go that far, and some of the timeline stuff is also difficult. I haven't really been able to figure out exactly like what his beliefs were when he wrote War and Peace compared to later on in life. Because he definitely changed later on in life and ended up like kind of renouncing War and Peace and his other organic critica because he, changed his mind about a lot of things. So I don't think his emphasis of like calculus and War and Peace really had much to do with religion per se. I think it's fascinating how much you can use math to start thinking about explaining some divine things. It's interesting.
Eric.
So, if I'm not mistaken, Tolstoy is saying the way to understand history is to account for the infinite number of human wills that are all acting in the same moment. So, does Tolstoy have a practical method for actually doing something?
Absolutely not. It's interesting. There's a lot of different perspectives, but you definitely get some criticism of. One scholar I remember called it some outlandish calculus, and other people criticize, other things about his work. And sure, it's not very practical, but I think it's just interesting as a way to think about it. It's a metaphor to try and understand exactly what he wants to communicate.
Great. Sarah.
I was just wondering if there was anything specific, and I know you've kind of talked about not knowing exactly like Tolstoy's beliefs and all of that, but just like what kept him back from still calling faith irrational, and just if there was any more detail about that specifically.
What held him back? I think it's just the very logicalness of this. Reading through Confession is interesting, but it's a lot of repetition of him can't quite figuring things out, and it's only when he comes to think about the relationship between finite and infinite that he starts to accept it more. Trying to remember exactly what was in the book, but I think it's just the difficulty of not quite being able to reach it by reason alone and having to accept something from outside of it that is hard, and it is hard.
And we have people who think that way. We've always had people, right, who struggle with that. They want the tangible, objective evidence before they believe something. And that's not how God works. That's not fully what faith is. And so if you have someone who thinks like that, yet it's a different kind of challenge for that person to put their faith in Jesus Christ, right, and that God exists. They can do it, of course, but it's a unique kind of challenge. And interestingly, math can be a really powerful tool. Can you very, very, on a simple level, explain to people what integration is in calculus in a very simple way? If you could say it in one or two sentences, how would you describe what it means to do integration?
essentially it's a process of just adding up a lot of extremely small elements to get a bigger whole.
That's perfect. It's perfect.
Alright.
Yeah, when you're trying to measure, for instance, a curve that doesn't fit a simple, how do you take the area of a rectangle? In non-math people, rectangle is length times width. Awesome. Okay, good. Science person. But what if you have a shape that's not at all a rectangle? Right? There's no shape. It's just a thing. How do you take the shape in that? Well, if you put, say, 3 big rectangles in that shape, you can get a rough idea, but it's going to be really inaccurate. Right? If you do 3 rectangles, let's say you try to squeeze 30 rectangles in that space. Well, it's still going to be inaccurate, but it's better. Get the idea? If you put 3 million rectangles in there, then you're getting closer to the real area of that odd-looking shape. If you put an infinite number, which is what you do in calculus, you put a limit that approaches infinity, then you actually calculate what that area is. By taking an infinitesimal number of very tiny small measurements, you can get something bigger. So that's the idea of applying integral calculus to the movement of history. Does that help? Get that idea, right? This infinitesimal number of decisions by all the people on the planet, that's what's moving history. That's a pretty fascinating kind of juxtaposition of disciplines. It's a really interesting topic. Yeah.
All right, thank you.
No, you did a great job. All right, let's have time for a couple of other questions here. Let's just go back down the road. Eric, do you have a second one?
Yeah. Can we really say that humanity as a whole, that we can apply these laws, even if it is still human behavior, and we try to use, people tend to, or societies tend to do this, can we actually put those kind of solid laws on that?
Another good question that I'm definitely not going to have a perfect answer to. I think it's interesting to, think about, trying to think. I feel like I also just read one article where the scholar was like, if we try to describe kind of this metaphor as, how do I put it in words? If we notice human tendencies on the smallest scale, if we really understood that, it would probably help us understand tendencies of humanity as a whole, as in general. I don't know, that wasn't exactly the answer to your question, but there's a lot of interesting things to think about.
I just wonder if this, we talked a similar thing about this in general psychology, of Skinner box, where you have certain things that are controlled, and he was a materialist. So is this a similar thing that's saying, in theory, everything is determined because, I don't know, like, are we just rats in a box that do the things that our environment tells us to do? Is he kind of pointing towards that direction, or is he pointing towards, if we add the infinite in, then that means it's a non-human thing because we're not infinite creatures, and that points to a God?
Yeah, I think, as I kind of talked about, even though it may appear like a very deterministic, like, yeah, we don't have any control model, I don't think that's exactly what Tolstoy meant. There was also one scholar, there's so many interesting perspectives, and I couldn't really bring them all in, who just thought this integration metaphor was more of an example of how, we can't actually know history because we can't, do all of this outlandish calculus stuff. Like, that's impossible. So really he's dealing more with the uncertainty of all of it, because we can't actually take into account what every single person is doing at any given time to come to understanding of history.
All right, any questions from the audience?
It's not really related to your topic. I was just wondering if you had a chance to do the common reading, and if that was a book that intrigued you, because it was math-based, Flatlands.
Read what?
The common reading. I don't know.
Oh, I've been meaning to do that. Yes. Thanks for the reminder.
I think you'll enjoy it.
You will enjoy it.
Yes, thanks for the reminder. I need to get on that.
That's a great question. Mrs. Orff.
Does Tolstoy say how important math should be for historians, or maybe others who are doing humanities? I guess my question is, should we require calculus of all before college? What is your opinion, and maybe his, if you know?
My opinion is everyone should take calculus, but I don't think it's that essential to understanding history, unless you want to understand Tolstoy.
There you go.
I remember I was really intimidated by calculus. I had to take 2 semesters of it for my degree, and I was like, The name scared me, but I got in there, and the concepts of calculus I found very interesting, very intriguing, and I was glad I had to take it because it really opened my mind to some concepts that were really interesting. So, Skylar, great job. Appreciate it. Todd, come on. And Todd will finish us off tonight with meaningful work. Meaningful work.
In our society today, we have been searching for meaning, and we're looking for it in work. Work has never been just about work. Beyond the need for survival, human beings have gained a sense of fulfillment and purpose through the work that they do. Both individuals and organizations attribute meaning to the actions, processes, and accomplishments that arise from their labor. Today, however, the role of meaningfulness in work is increasingly debated. With younger generations entering the workforce and often choosing a greater sense of purpose over higher pay, the question of what makes work meaningful has become more relevant than ever. Meaningfulness in work is an inherently human pursuit, one that not only enhances personal well-being, but can also produce positive outcomes for organizations. This subject that I'm about to dive into tonight is one that I found to be very, very difficult, specifically in how we can first define meaning and meaningfulness. It's very difficult to articulate that, and a lot of the research that I'm going to kind of nitpick and grab from today is from a specific and particular source, and that's where I'm going to kind of dive into. And it goes through us talking things like this. What does meaning and significance mean? Meaning, in of itself, is significance that is intrinsic, which is kind of like maybe round reasoning of me just saying that, but specifically, meaning is for something to be significant, intrinsic to itself. By itself, it has meaning. Meaningfulness is the level or the degree to which we personally experience or feel that meaning or that significance. To break it down a little bit further, if meaning was to be described as a cognitive understanding, meaningfulness would be the emotional experience that we feel from that. In other words, meaning can be the story that we tell ourselves about why our work matters, whereas meaningfulness is the emotional fulfillment and lived experience that arises from that story. To kind of break this down a little bit further, significance is best described by two terms that it kind of umbrellas over. And it specifically goes through the terms of self-realization and broader purpose. Self-realization is basically how something could be significant of how it benefits me. Me individually as myself. Does something make me more authentic as myself? Does it help me learn? Does it help me grow? That is what it means to be significant with self-realization. How does it influence me? If we're talking about the meaning or in the sense of a story again, self-realization is how does this story help me? Broader purpose is on the flip side of that, and a little bit more of, well, how the word says is broader. If I was to describe significance as a story, it's how does significance affect or impact the rest of others around me? If something has meaning, then not only will it maybe possibly help myself with self-realization, but how is it going to help other people? What is the pro-social or the collective benefit that extends beyond myself? These two together is kind of the application of what meaning is and how we see it in the world today. And so I needed to kind of describe and define these terms before we go further into this so we can understand what's going on and what this means. And I know you're probably going to hear the word meaning and meaningfulness more times than you can count, but we're just going to roll with it anyways. To describe this best, we can look at a historical context because this is a naturally human thing that we've been doing. We've been talking about it for a long time. We've been debating about it for a long time, and we see it arise in different ways. The first one is Aristotle. He described among his peers a term called eudaimonia. It's often translated as happiness or well-being, but many believes that it describes a life lived in service of a higher virtue. He wasn't necessarily studying meaningful activity, but specifically a purpose-driven life is what Aristotle was kind of studying there. It wasn't necessarily how I felt about it, but it was the pursuit of something more, of the pursuit of learning something more. The critic that we know and love is Karl Marx. He goes and talks about the concept of alienation. He says, we have meaningful lives, but capitalism ruins that for us. And so let me talk about how bad capitalism is. And what he goes into and dives into like this is employees or the workers are oppressed by the employers or the superiors that are above them because the superiors take and extract meaningfulness out of work. And specifically, the capitalist system oppresses these workers in ways such as this. Workers having their products are owned by their capitalist employers. They're under forced labor, and specifically the competition that capitalism creates disrupts social ties. And so what we can see from these two guys here is basically they're telling us that meaning has been studied for a very long period of time, and what does it mean for ourselves individually, but what does it mean for the economy as itself too, and what meaningful work can describe. And so the question then becomes is, we've kind of described what meaning is and what meaningful work can look like. The question then becomes is, what does the impact that it has and what evidence does it produce? What I'd like to talk about and what I really want to describe is a meta-analysis by Dr. Blake Allen and his colleagues. This describes and goes through an entire span of research going from the 1980s to the 2010s. To break this down, his study is basically just saying there's all this research on meaningfulness and what it means for work. I'm just going to sum it up real quick. And that's what he does. He takes 177 independent studies and breaks that down and says this is what it's going to look like and this is what we can learn from it. The coolest thing about this is he finds a very large correlation. If you're looking at your correlational coefficient, something from stats, 0.7 and higher is what he's seeing between meaningful work and these kinds of outcomes. He's seeing that when workers are engaged in what they deem as meaningful work, they have larger work engagement, that's correlated to higher job satisfaction, and it's also correlated to organizational commitment. These are all things that whenever we hear them, we're like, I would just love more of that. That's awesome. And specifically, if you're a business owner and you see that this could happen, if your workers are feeling like their work is meaningful, you want some of that too, because it helps you and helps grow your business and helps make things better. Not only that, there's even more connections that we see here and more correlations. Whenever we are engaged in meaningful work, not only does it help our organizational structure, but it helps us here as individuals. We feel a greater sense of life satisfaction, that our general health is correlated to be higher whenever we feel like we've engaged in meaningful work. It's difficult because this is kind of a survey-based research method, which is kind of like, okay, you're self-reporting all this information of how you feel about this work. So the danger of this is, and I'll kind of preface this, is there could be other factors that are impacting these studies. Because you can't isolate someone entirely to tell me, okay, is your work meaningful or not? There's other factors in your life that are going to impact that. But what I hope to see and hope what y'all can understand is among the 177 studies, and I believe it was 43,000 participants, of all these things, we have a very high correlation between these two, and that they are impacting each other in some way, and that we can gather evidence from this. This research ultimately shows that meaningful work isn't just a psychological or a moral pursuit, but this could and can be a strategic advantage for organizations seeking to motivate and enhance overall performance. We see the evidence of it, but the question is what does that mean for us today, and what can we imply from this? What's happening now is that Gen Z and millennials are now joining the workforce at an increasingly larger rate. And not only that, it's just that the older generations are getting older, and so now younger generations are rising up to take their place. And so by the year 2030, 74% of the economy is going to be made up of Gen Z and millennials. And if they're going to take such a higher stake in our economy and our workforce, we need to figure out what they're about. What we learn from here is this, is they pursue a trifecta of three different things. They pursue meaning, they pursue money, and they pursue well-being. And what's interesting about that here, and what I'll talk about, is that they're giving up on money. That Gen Z and specifically millennials are now giving up higher paying jobs to pursue one thing out of this trifecta, and for the most part it's meaning. That they're searching for and seeking out meaning. And what we see from that here is nearly half of them, if they're evaluating their job or their employer or the company that they're going to join, half of them say, I want my work to be meaningful, and that's going to impact my decision of where I go and what I'm going to do. What it also tells us here too is, guess what? if this job doesn't fill my needs, I will leave within 2 years. And it's a statistically significant, specifically among Gen Z, with 1/3 of them being willing to leave within the first 2 years, that they're not motivated as much by this salary or what can be given to them, but they're willing to leave and they're willing to go somewhere else. You're probably wondering about what the impacts of this are if we're only pursuing meaningful work and we're not willing to stick around in our jobs. This study that I was going through is basically the challenge that it becomes is if people aren't investing into corporations, if we're only pursuing companies that align with what I believe in and we're not pursuing anything that goes along with them, you don't get corporate leadership. That eventually, as time goes on, you don't have people rising up in the ranks, you don't have people learning a business, you have people just jumping around trying to fit and find whatever pleases them. And so we need to understand what these impacts are and specifically what businesses need to do. And as we dive into this, we need to understand how businesses can move forward like this. The generations that we're looking at, they're telling us that they seek an alignment between their values and their labor. And of course, this is going to impact businesses and organizations. And employers, they need to find ways to incorporate and communicate meaning at work. Gallup research suggests that a 10% improvement in employees' connection to a mission of a business corresponds to very tangible outcomes. The two outcomes being an 8.1% drop in turnover and a 4% increase in profitability. Although it's important that our job clarity and the organizational structure of a company matters, what we see in these generations is they are looking for an emotional connection to their work, that they want to feel a connection between their values and the company's mission, and that is what gives us sustained performance. What this research tells us and shows us here is it demonstrates that meaningful work benefits both individuals and the organization simultaneously. It's very interesting that we see that, and the research kind of concludes and takes us right back to where we were at the beginning when we talked about meaning and significance. Meaning and significance being broken down into self-realization on one side, but then broader purpose on the other. And so what we conclude from the research and what we see is that individuals are looking for themselves to be served through self-realization, but they also care about the broader purpose, and they care that the work that they do helps themselves, but also helps a larger group of people at the same time. Meaningful work is about more than just getting by or accomplishing tasks. It extends beyond survival and accomplishments, providing fulfillment and purpose for individuals while generating benefits for organizations. Philosophical perspectives such as Aristotle and Marx show an enduring desire for purposeful labor and highlight ways that economic systems could disrupt them. In modern research, Dr. Blake Allen's meta-analysis helps analyze correlations between meaningful work and outcomes such as engagement, job satisfaction, and organizational commitment. As millennials and Gen Z prioritize personal values and seek alignment with purpose, organizations face the challenge of turnover rates and lagging performance. By aligning personal values with corporate missions, management helps foster meaningful work and boost performance. Meaningful work is not just a psychological or social construct. It is a strategic tool for organizations, leaders, and employees to influence valuable change. And so as we dive into that and break it down, I couldn't help but as I studied this research and as I'm trying to answer these questions, what does the Bible have to say about this and how does this impact us as Christians? The thing I'd like to dive into is a verse here from Ecclesiastes 5 and in verse 18. Behold, what I have seen to be good and fitting is to eat and drink and find enjoyment in all the toil with which one toils under the sun, the few days of his life that God has given him, for this is his lot. Everyone also to whom God has given wealth and possessions and power to enjoy them, and to accept his lot and rejoice in his toil. This is the gift of God. For he will not much remember the days of his life, because God keeps him occupied with joy in his heart. Our lives and our work have meaning because God gave it. Since Genesis 1 and 2, God has stated that we have meaning and shows us in this by the plans that he has for us and the work that we have to do. The course of the Bible shows the story of how meaningful we are to God and the love that he has for us. And so as we go throughout this study and as we learn and ask questions, I wanted to make sure that this is clear, that God tells us that we are meaningful, that he loves us, and specifically, we can pursue meaningful work because those are the things that he has for us. Thank you.
Appreciate it. All right, Sarah.
I was just wondering with this like meaningfulness and work, working from home is becoming a big thing. So I was just wondering if your research or anything included how that might affect like the meaningfulness or what people think about meaning in work right now.
I did not get to dive into that very much. The one thing that I'd like to kind of, I don't know if I have it on the screen here, but when I talk about the emotional connection that workers feel with their values and that they're trying to align it with corporate values, so much of that is based in, as I kind of already said, like a personal value thing. And what we need to understand and kind of be able to describe is how can employers do that? And I haven't made the point very clear, but I think this challenge is very difficult for organizations to do this, because how do you as an organization make people's own personal feelings align with your organization? Like, how do you do that? How do you stay true to who you are as an organization, but also serve the feelings of these people at the same time? And so I'm very curious how companies are going to be able to do that, because it's very difficult. And I don't know what the exact answer is to that. That's very long-winded.
Good question, because that does change the dynamic, right? If I'm home by myself versus in the office with the office pool and doing whatever, you know, you sort of generate a community, and you can have community with working online, but it's a very different kind of dynamic. Eric.
So if people are just looking for the jobs where they can find meaning, could that result in sort of gaps in the job market anywhere?
I definitely would agree. It's what was kind of just scary to me was just seeing that people were so willing to leave their jobs whether or not they found that their work to be meaningful. And what's very interesting too is, like, I was talking about with a group of my friends the other day, it's like we don't consider like corporate leadership. We don't talk about that. We're not thinking about it. We care about entrepreneurship, doing what we want to do, and specifically going back to that trifecta of my money, meaning, and well-being. Like, as long as it takes care of my lifestyle, then what more does it matter? And what was your original question? I'm sorry.
Would there be like specific gaps in the job market?
See, I don't know, and I'm very curious about that when it comes to people just doing whatever they want, if it emotionally aligns with them, and how that lines up. I'm curious about that.
All right, Ruth.
Can people find meaning in any kind of work, or only work that they're intrinsically motivated to do?
I think that goes back to kind of the concept of significance, because it does depend on what the individual chooses to be significant. Because I can choose, I'm trying to think of a good example off the fly, but specifically when it comes to self-realization, that's the process of me saying I choose to do this work because it makes me better. I like to, like Gabe had talked about, like I like to work out because it makes me feel healthier, or I like to read books because I think it makes me smarter. But it's a different thing to say that I'm working out to save somebody from a burning building, or I'm reading these books to be able to share knowledge and ideas with other people that maybe don't have them yet. And so that's what I'm curious of, is where that applies to. It just was interesting to me that we find it in both. Like, it doesn't have to be just one or the other, but we could find it in both. And so as much as it is maybe internally motivated of my emotions make me feel this way, it also goes both ways of it could be for myself, but I could serve other people at the same time. It's interesting how they both exist there.
All right. Hallie?
In your opinion, do you think that having a strong sense of meaningful work is more beneficial than having a healthy work-life balance?
I would say it's very interesting that you brought that up, because the research also talked about it too. Is there's a lot of people that they would feel that their work was very meaningful, but it destroyed their well-being. Is because they're like, I will do whatever it is to serve this job, but I do not care about myself in taking care of myself on the flip side of it too. I would say I think it's more significant for somebody to pursue meaningful work, because I think you can find well-being in it at the same time. I think that trifecta is something, if we could all find all three, man, that would be good. But I think that's what we're kind of seeing the most of. Does that kind of answer your question? I think I'm leaning more towards the meaningful side of things.
You kind of answered my question, but do you think that meaningfulness in work is such an important thing in our society today, that can be almost a danger of discontentment across people in our generation in jobs, of hopping from one job to another because it never fulfills you.
And see, that's kind of like what was my driving question of this, is because growing up, I was surrounded by older people. And older people always did jobs that were very difficult, manual labor, the ones I was surrounded by, and they never complained about it. And they never asked for more, and they never asked for less. It was always, this is my job that I'm going to go do, and this is what I'm just going to kind of go along with. And that's what I'm so curious of is, and kind of my thought process going into this, are like, are we just like really ungrateful? Like we just cannot just say, okay, I'm thankful for the way I've been provided for, but I have to pursue something extra, like meaningfulness. Like what's that about? And that's what I'm kind of curious of is that going to move people around? I'm not sure. But that's kind of been my background, what's been going on in my mind besides this, behind that question.
That difference you just articulated, for where is it that you said people just say, hey, this is just my job, this is what I do? Who are those people you're just...
I see them a lot in just like the older generations
Right.
in that kind of sense.
Carl Trueman wrote a book, I think 2 years ago, called The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self. The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self. And he addresses that, part of his address in that book. They read it in Great Books this spring as sort of not one of the official books, it's sort of their extra tack-on book in the Great Books this spring. And he addresses part of that generational shift in how do we view self, how do we define self today as opposed to a generation or two ago. And he addresses that, the role of work, and how people viewed work as a thing I go to versus work as part of me, and therefore it needs meaning because work, it's part of me more than it used to. It was really interesting. So if you want an extra read, Carl Trueman, right after Tolstoy. Right? Bookshelves are getting big. Mary?
How do you think that as Christians we can balance the fact that our work is a service to God and that should give it meaning, but also we have so many other aspects of our life, kind of the work-life balance thing, so many aspects of our life outside of work in which to serve God, and how do we provide and see that as a service to God? Do you know what I'm saying?
Yes. Could you clarify your question just a little bit more?
Sorry, this was a wild card question. I did not prepare, and then I just thought of it. Like if you're going to work and that's how you provide for your family and that's how you do those things that you need to do, but also the meaning in your work you see as something that serves God, then how do you do both and do both of them in service to God?
I think what you just dived into is you just like undermined my entire presentation. And like, there's actually 3 things that go under significance, and one of them is the significance to God as well. I think as Christians that supersedes for us in a bunch of different ways. The one thing that's that you touched on, another kind of ulterior motive to me studying this is like, I'm a graduating senior, and the question is like, okay, Todd, do you go get a job that serves you and helps make you money, or do you go and do you look for meaningfulness in that you pursue a job that serves other people? And that's kind of like what's been that question of, am I going along right with culture, or how do I navigate that, or how do we navigate that in that sense? And I'm very curious about that when it comes to living a quiet, modest life, as 1 Thessalonians says, and me doing my job and not causing too much of a scene to myself, but then also doing everything, working heartily for the Lord and working not for men, but for the Lord. That's been a very challenging thing for me to think of as well. For me personally, I think as Christians, our meaning is given to us. We don't find it. It's already told to us, and we find it in Scripture because it's right on the page. Whether we choose to accept it or not is kind of up to us. And whether we find that meaningful or not to ourselves, that also becomes the question. And so I think for us as Christians, we see meaning, but the question then becomes to us as well is it going to be meaningful to us or not?
Laura?
Do you think that the automation of many less meaningful jobs with today's technology contributes to younger generation's ability to pursue more meaningful work?
Could you say that one more time?
Do you think the automation of many less meaningful jobs contributes to the younger generation's ability to pursue more meaningful work?
I'm very curious about that. I have no idea. I didn't see that hardly in any of my research. It was just interesting to see that the research just kind of showed we can find find positive outcomes from meaningful work. And so it didn't articulate too much of what that necessarily was. And that'd be a cool thing to dive into of like, okay, blue collar work versus white collar work. Where are there higher instances of meaningfulness and where do we feel that there? That's very interesting. I'm not sure.
We talked to a lot of farmers in rural Kentucky. I mean, that is hard 24/7 a day work. That's who they are. You know, that is deep meaning in that kind of hard work. Getting back to Eric's question, are there going to be some menial tasks that people don't want to do? But you're saying maybe those are automated, so people don't have to do those as much, right? They can now do. Interesting. All right, Luke.
So talking about Karl Marx a little bit, do you think that Marx's beliefs and actions showing the shortcomings of capitalism allowed for the advance and improvement of meaningfulness in capitalism for the future? Because like in Europe, capitalism was terrible in Marx's time, and so it's obvious where he got his idea that we have to go completely opposite of capitalism with communism. And so how do you think that his pointing out like helped meaningfulness be imbued in the future?
I think a lot of it goes back to the challenge that corporations face as well, and organizations in general, of like, how am I supposed to give meaningfulness to the members of my organization when it's a feeling that they feel? Like it's an emotional experience that they respond to that. And that's what's tough, is because I think that's what Marx kind of dives into so much of is, well, people feel this way, and what are we supposed to do about it? And I think that's, it's very difficult for us to kind of face that. But also, I think whenever we see that, maybe we can't hold corporations totally accountable. Where does that accountability lie to? I think it falls on us as well as individuals of like, the way my perception and the way I perceive my job and the story that I tell myself about my job says a lot about how I'm going to do that work and the outcomes that I feel from that. So if I say that my job benefits me because I go to work and I'm learning more about my limits, my abilities, my capabilities, and I see that I'm growing, then I can see meaningfulness in that job. I can see meaning in it. And if I say this job that I'm doing, if I'm a firefighter, I'm saving lives, I'm helping other people, then I see not only that as I'm growing myself, but I'm protecting my community, I'm serving a broader purpose. And so I think that's where it kind of comes down to of, yes, as a whole we can say, these are the flaws of capitalism, and this is the things that we can do to fix it. But I would also say it just falls so much of it on us as individuals. And I wish I articulated that more in the paper of, there is an accountability, I think, that comes with meaningfulness. And we need to be able to articulate that, but also accept the responsibility that comes with it as well.
Interesting question, because I mean, nothing brought suffering to the 20th century like Karl Marx ideas. I mean, tens of millions of people died because of communism. In the Soviet Union, China, and Cambodia. I mean, horrific suffering. You talk about losing all meaning. Live in a communist country. I mean, your meaning as an individual is non-existent. But maybe it taught capitalists something. Maybe there's like, hey, yeah, we're really abusive and manipulative and coercive with people here, so we need to figure something out. Maybe so. All right, anyone else with the second question on the panel row? Second question for Todd. All right, from the audience? Yes, Ms. Zoll.
So kind of goes along with what Meredith was asking, but do you feel that this search for meaning in work, and I don't know I have any statistics on this, but do you feel like this search for meaning in work correlates to the decrease in the number of young people who identify as Christian? So like they're seeking meaning and fulfillment from earthly things rather than finding it fulfillment in Christ regardless of what they're doing, which I think plays into what you were saying about the older generation. Some of that's just ingrained in them, but do you feel like there's a correlation to faith and how many people identify maybe as like Christian?
I would say it's difficult to correlate those two. I think a great place to look for that is Gallup. They do some really good stuff, and then also Pew Research as well. I would say that the correlation is difficult to find because I would say kind of the thesis of my paper, what I'm trying to understand was me going back to, okay, are jobs just something we do or do we derive meaning from them? And what I gathered was meaning is something that we can apply to anything. And so that's one thing that I would say is maybe, I wouldn't say that it's easy to say, well, we found a lack of meaning in the church, so we now go pursue it in work. I think it's more so that we as humans will search for meaning, and for what we now do, the idol that we throw it to, it can be the workplace, and that's definitely something there. to kind of add on to this, the second thing that we've been studying in marketing as well is the, how do I say it, the sharing economy. We love to do Airbnbs, Ubers, things like that, where we bring buyers and sellers together. We use technology to do that. That's basically what a sharing economy is. But what we've seen and what we're kind of curious of on the rise is, our economy is going to turn into more community-based. Of like, you see farmers markets, you see we're getting a bunch of people together for this event and for this this thing taking place. Is that going to give us a new sense of community and a new sense of meaning? And that's what I'm curious of. I love that you brought up this question, because it's like, if there's an absence of meaning somewhere else, what's going to fill its place? And is that what we're pursuing now in work? I'm not sure.
Todd, thank you very much, brother. Thank you once again the four speakers. All did an excellent job this evening. Thank you for our panelists for the questions. And thank you all for joining us for this evening. We are concluded, and I bid you a very good evening.